Hello, I'm Katie Broomfield. I'm a researcher in the History Department at Royal Holloway, University of London. Peter and Hazel Mary Bull are devout Christians. Under Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is enshrined in UK law by the Human Rights Act 1998, they have a right, which we all share, to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. As the owner-occupiers of a hotel in Cornwall, and exercising their religious belief that sex outside marriage is a sin, Mr and Mrs Bull implemented a policy that they would not accept bookings for double rooms from unmarried couples. However, as they were to find, the right to freedom of religion is not an unlimited right. In 2008, Stephen Preddy booked a double room at Mr and Mrs Bull's hotel. When he arrived at the hotel with his civil partner, Martin Hall, he was told that because he was not married to Mr Hall, the booking would not be honoured. Mr Preddy and Mr Hall were left feeling hurt and upset and believed Mr and Mrs Bull's policy discriminated against them on the ground that they were homosexual. Like the rest of us, Mr Hall and Mr Preddy have a right not to be discriminated against on the ground of their sexual orientation. At the time, Mr Hall's and Mr Preddy's rights were protected by the Equality Act Sexual Orientation Regulations 2007. The case of Bull and Hall is an example of a dispute between two sets of individuals, all of whom have a protected characteristic, described by Baroness Hale as a characteristic which protects them from discrimination in a wide variety of areas of activity. This case demonstrates what happens and how the courts will act when the rights of such individuals, in this case with the protected characteristics of religion and sexual orientation, clash. I'm now joined by Dr. David Juretić, who's a lecturer in the School of Law at Royal Holloway, University of London, to find out a little bit more about this case. I understand that the case started in the Bristol County Court. Is that right, David?
Yes, that's right. In January 2011, Mr Preddy and Mr Hall's claims for unlawful discrimination were upheld in the Bristol County Court. They were each awarded £1,800 in damages.
So they must have been quite happy with that result?
Yes, presumably they were, but the Bulls were understandably less happy with it. So they appealed the decision to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal dismissed their appeal in February 2012.
So it was Mr and Mrs Bull who appealed to the Supreme Court?
Yes, that's correct. At this point, this was the only court they could take their case to. It was the highest court in the country, and the Supreme Court gave their decision in November 2013.
And what was the question the Supreme Court had to consider?
Put simply, it was whether or not a Christian hotel keeper who sincerely believed that sex outside marriage was sinful could lawfully refuse to rent a room, a double-bedded room, to a same-sex couple.
And what was the legal test to be applied?
So the legal test here was that the court had to decide if this policy amounted to direct discrimination or indirect discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation.
And what's the difference between direct and indirect discrimination?
Sure, well, at the time, the relevant law was the Equality Act Sexual Orientation Regulations 2007, and these defined direct discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation as when you treat two groups of people differently purely because of their sexual orientation. Indirect discrimination, on the other hand, is when a policy applies equally to all people, but the effect of it is in fact discriminate against one group on the basis of their sexual orientation. And what's important here is that direct discrimination in this particular context could not be justified, whereas indirect discrimination could have been justified on the basis of Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights.
So presumably Mr and Mrs Bull said that they hadn't directly discriminated against Mr Hall and Mr Preddy?
Yes, that's right. The Bulls argued that they had not directly discriminated on the basis of sexuality or sexual orientation, but instead on the basis of marital status. They relied on the fact that they applied this policy to all unmarried couples and did turn away unmarried heterosexual couples as well. And while they accepted that this policy might amount to indirect discrimination, they maintained that it would still be justified on the basis of their religious beliefs, because Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights establishes the right to freedom of religion, and they argued that the state could not compel them to run their business in a way that runs contrary to their fundamental religious beliefs, and that Article 9 protected them from such interference.
So, seeking to balance those rights, what did the Supreme Court decide?
Well, in a demonstration of just how complex competing rights cases like this can be, the Supreme Court decided by a majority of 3-2 that there had been direct discrimination in this case. Particularly important here was the fact that the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act, which allowed same-sex couples in England and Wales to marry when it came into force in 2013, was not on the statute books at the time. There was no way that any same-sex couple could ever satisfy this policy, and that's why the majority said it was direct discrimination.
And I understand that the lead judgment was given by Baroness Hale, who has since been appointed as the first female president of the Supreme Court. So what did she have to say on that issue?
Yes, so in her judgment, Lady Hale explained that while civil partnership is not called marriage, in almost every other respect it is indistinguishable from the status of marriage in UK law. So as a result, she held that the Bull's policy, which resulted in married and civilly partnered people being treated differently, was direct discrimination.
And did she say what she would have done if she had found indirect discrimination? Would that have been justified, for example?
In her view, it would not have been, and all the other judges agreed with her here. Even the two that disagreed on the direct discrimination point agreed that if it was instead a case of indirect discrimination, Article 9 did not allow the Bulls to justify their policy, because that right has to be balanced against the rights of others. Here, the right of Preddy and Hull to not be discriminated against. The Equality Act Sexual Orientation Regulations 2007, according to which this case was decided, have since been replaced by the Equality Act 2010. However, as Lady Hale pointed out, the principles, concepts and provisions with which the Supreme Court was concerned have remained much the same. Although same-sex marriage is now legal in this country, and some of the facts particular to this case no longer apply, the general principles of how the courts balance individual citizens' rights remain relevant. Commentators have criticised the decision in Bull and Hull for being an attack upon religion and for failing to strike the right balance between protecting citizens' conflicting rights to freedom of religion while protecting others against discrimination. In particular, Mr. and Mrs. Bull objected to the support given to Mr. Preddy and Mr. Hull by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who pursued this case. They objected to the EHRC supporting Mr. Preddy and Mr. Hull's protected characteristic of sexual orientation against their own protected characteristic of religion. This led an aggrieved Mrs. Bull to suggest that while much is said about equality and diversity, it seems some people are more equal than others, a claim which has been repeated in the media. However, as Lady Hale explained, this misunderstands the nature of the case. If Mr. Preddy and Mr. Hull were hotel keepers who had refused a room to Mr. and Mrs. Bull because they were Christians, or even because they were an opposite-sex couple, no doubt the Commission would have been just as ready to support Mr. and Mrs. Bull in their claim. In short, what this case demonstrates is that all individuals have the same right as any other to be protected against discrimination from any other.